everyone. This is their cross-platform SQL Server Management Edition. We're excited that you could join us today for Julie Lerman's session, SQL Server Containers for Developers. This 24 Hours of Pass event consists of 24 consecutive live webinars delivered by expert speakers from the Pass community. The sessions will be recorded and posted online after the event. You will receive an email letting you know when those recordings are available. My name is Ree Irish. I run the Women in Technology virtual group for Pass, and I'm a Microsoft MVP in the data platform. And before I get to hand things over to Julie, there's a couple of introductory slides that we need to go through. So if you require technical assistance during this webinar, please type your question into the question pane located on the right-hand side of your screen. Someone will assist you. And by someone, I mean me. This question pane is also where you may ask any questions throughout the presentation. Feel free to enter your questions at any time. And once we get to the Q&A portion of the session, I'll read your questions aloud to Julie. You are able to zoom in on the presentation content by using the Zoom button located at the top of the presentation window. And please note that there will be a short evaluation at the end of the session. Your feedback is important to us, so please take a moment to complete it. This will pop up after the webinar ends in your web browser. I'd like to take a moment to thank our presenting sponsors today, Microsoft, Quest, Idera, and SentryOne, and a supporting sponsor, Redgate. The staging of 24 Hours of Pass would not be possible without their generous support, and they are the reason this event is available free of charge. If you would like to learn more about our sponsors and sign up for information on how they can help you, please visit the sponsors page of the 24 Hours of Pass website. Julie, can you go forward a few slides for me? I'm sorry.
Oh, yes. Oh, there's the technical assistance. There's our presenting sponsors. And here you go.
So one more, we're now on Pass Summit. So one more, sorry about that.
Oh, that's what I'm seeing on my screen.
Yes, there. So okay. Pass Summit is the Pass community's flagship event, and it is happening November 6th through 9th in Seattle, Washington. Pass Summit is the largest conference for technical professionals who leverage the Microsoft data platform. So you can immerse yourself in deep dive technical sessions, learn best practices, and discover new tips and tricks. For any of you on this webinar today who haven't attended Pass Summit, you should seriously consider it. And there are plenty of discount codes out there right now from different user groups and SQL Saturdays that can save you $150 on signing up. The technical sessions will absolutely directly impact your career, and so will all of the networking that you're going to get to do. Julie, if you'll go forward one more slide.
It's there. It seems like there's some lag time between when I see it and when you see it.
This 24 Hours of Pass session is presented by Julie Lerman. Julie is a Microsoft Regional Director, longtime Microsoft MVP, and a Docker captain who now counts her years as a coder in decades. She makes her living as a coach and consultant to software teams around the world. You can find Julie presenting on Entity Framework, domain-driven design, and other topics at user groups and conferences around the world. Julie blogs at thedatafarm.com/blog and is also the author of the highly acclaimed Programming Entity Framework books, the MSDN Magazine Data Points column, and popular videos on Pluralsight. So next slide, Julie. And so I will go ahead and turn it over to her now. SQL Server Containers for Developers.
Great, thanks so much, Bree. I'm gonna just turn off my webcam because I live in the boondocks and I have the slowest internet. Stop sharing my webcam. So that'll be just, there we go. Okay, so also Bree, just speak up if it seemed like when I was sharing screens for you that there was some kind of a lag, some latency there. So if I'm talking about something because I see it on the screen, but you don't see it yet, just say something and I'll pause until it's there. I'm just going to try to pay attention to that. So SQL Server containers for developers. This was how I felt the very first time I saw a SQL Server instance running in Docker. And hopefully, again, how's the timing on the slides now? Is it working for you?
The slide, I don't know if that's supposed to be a GIF, or GIF, depending on who you are. But I
Yeah.
see the slide.
Yay! All right. So that's how
There
I
we
felt
go.
about containers. With the first time I actually saw SQL Server starting up in Docker. And so I really wanted to share that experience with other people, especially developers who aren't into DevOps and might be a little daunted by containers, and also might be wondering why on earth you would want to run your database in a container. So I'm going to spend a good part of this, an important goal for me is to make sure you really understand the concept of containers and Docker and what that is. And then we'll talk about why SQL Server in Docker or in a container. And then I'm going to show you some technical stuff so you have an idea of how to really get started with this. So it's really important first to define container. So a container is a self-contained unit. It's an execution environment that you can run on your system that contains an entire application with all of its resources. So you're running the application in the container. You're not running this application, such as SQL Server, directly on your operating system. And a really important thing to understand is that a container is not a virtual machine. It took me a really long, first of all, it took me a long time to understand virtual machines. And I know enough to be dangerous about them as it is. But then when containers came along, it was really hard for me to disconnect my understanding of virtual machine for giving me the ability to understand what a container is. So if you can just remember, it is not a virtual machine. A container runs directly on your operating system. It's not an operating system in a box like a virtual machine is. And another interesting thing about containers is because they are contained, self-contained, you can actually have multiple instances of a container running at the same time. So that's just really helped me an enormous amount to really understand it. It's not a virtual machine. So Docker is, the famous container system, and how Docker works, what's underlying all of it is what's called the Docker engine. And I like to think of the Docker engine as being like this power strip. I can plug any number of containers into it. And okay, so power strip is kind of limited to 6. Maybe you have some memory limits on your computer, but I can plug containers into it, and then I plug the power strip or the Docker engine into my operating system. Okay, and Docker engine can run on so many different systems. You can run it on your desktop. I actually have it running here I'm working on a MacBook here, and I have it running on MacBook. I have Docker for Windows running on Windows. It's also supported in the cloud. So you can run Docker in Azure and on AWS. And also it can run on a number of servers, lots of Linux servers as well as Windows Server. So there's a lot of places you can take your container. Anywhere that Docker can run, you can take a single container image and use it in all those different places. You don't have to have a different one for a different system. So even with that, sometimes it's still hard to wrap your head around a really new idea. And I find that using a number of analogies helps me kind of triangulate and put all that stuff together. So here's another analogy, which might make sense to any of you who live in Germany. I learned a few years ago from 2 different friends that when you move into an apartment in Germany, there's no appliances. There's no kitchen cabinets. There's no nothing. It's just completely empty. Really hard to understand. So people, when they move, they don't just move their furniture. They pack up their kitchen and they put it in a box, right? Kitchen in a box. And since it's German, this is my idea of a word that would represent kitchen in a box, a containerized kitchen. So I've got all of my appliances, my refrigerator, my cupboards, my cabinetry, everything in that box. I go to a new apartment and I take all that stuff and reassemble it and plug it in. So the apartment is maybe my operating system. My kitchen in a box represents my container when it's all plugged in, and the Docker engine allows me to plug all of these things into the electrical utilities. So that helped me a lot. Hopefully that gives some of you a little more ability to try to really understand the concept of moving containers around. So I'm talking about containers here, but that's already the running thing. Where do these containers come from? How do you create a container? So it all starts with a simple little text file called a Docker file. And a Docker file, and it is, can really be a small file, just 5 or 6 lines even can do the trick. And it defines the contents of what should be in this container, as well as instructions for what should happen when you start up the container. So those runtime instructions. With Docker, you then build a Docker file, and the results of that build are what's called a Docker image. So that becomes a binary file with all of those content, all of those applications and other resources that are described in the Docker file, as well as all their dependencies, and those runtime instructions come along as well. Then you take an image and you run the image using the Docker run command, and that instantiates a container. That becomes the running instance of that image that's described by the Docker file. And as it's run, it also runs whatever is whatever's specified in those runtime instructions. Now, my session does have the words for developers in it. So I have another way of sharing this with you as if you're a developer. And this was actually something I read that was the first time that I finally had my aha moment with Docker and with containers. The Docker file is like a class definition. The Docker image is like the compiled version of that class, and the Docker container is the object instance when your application's running. So you can think of those different states of the Docker file, the Docker image, and the Docker container that way. So hopefully you have some understanding now of what a container is. Now we're here at 24 hours of SQL Pass, so the goal is to talk about SQL Server in a container. So you might already be thinking, okay, I understand containers a little bit now, and they're portable and I can have them on different machines. Why would I want to put my database in there? So first and most importantly for me is that you can quickly and really easily start up a whole new SQL Server instance on your development or test machines. That is exactly what gave me this, like, oh my God, the first time I saw it. As a matter of fact, that I found that GIF, I tweeted it. I was like, oh my God, I just did Docker run on a SQL Server container, and it didn't take me 45 minutes and lots of yes, click this, that to install SQL Server on my machine. I mean, it's just like amazing. Another really big advantage is, in addition to pre-creating your databases, and that's easy enough to share databases already created, but you can pre-configure the server that's supplied in this image and then share that across a team. So other people on your team can run that image and have the container running, and the server is already set up, configured the way you want it to be on all those machines. You also have the ability, because they're self-contained, you can run multiple containers on a single Docker engine on your system. you could actually have different versions of SQL Server. Right now, there aren't a lot of different versions, but at least there's different SKUs. So if you need to test against those different SKUs, and then eventually there will be different versions of SQL Server. So you can test your applications against those different versions if you need to. As easily as you can create an instance, you can take down an instance. So you could, do all your testing and really muck with that database and do all kinds of stuff with that databases on your server, do all kinds of stuff. And then you can say, maybe like me, especially if it's configuring SQL Server, I really messed things up so bad. I want to just start all over again. So I can just take down the container and just spin it up again, and it's all fresh and clean. But if you think about that in the context of an automated testing environment, so you could have an automated test that says, okay, I need to test against the database now. Zip up, you spin SQL Server inside of Docker, let the test do what they want to, and then completely remove that SQL Server instance. So it frees up all your resources, and so you can have multiple tests or whatever. So that's really an amazing thing for that kind of environment. So with respect to resources, you can stop a container, and actually everything that has happened inside the container since you started running it will get persisted if you only stop it. But you can also remove it completely. So all of the resources are freed back up. And it's even possible, if you remove it, it's even possible to have your data in a completely different container. So you can have the data container running without having the SQL Server instance container running. And then you can create a new SQL Server container and connect it to that volume, and boom, you've got all your persistence back. Now, from a DevOps perspective, there's also all kinds of other benefits. I'm not going to drill into those. So hopefully this isn't big news for you today, given that the whole platform of this 24 hours is about cross-platform SQL Server. But yes, we have SQL Server for Linux. And the important thing for the context of my session here is that SQL Server for Linux runs on Docker. So we can have Docker containers with SQL Server. And remember that Docker runs on all of these different platforms. So you can have SQL Server running on any one of these kind of platforms. So I've talked about containers. Containers come from images. Images come from a Docker file. So images are, you can have images that are just within your own organization. You create your own Docker repository, and people can pull images. You can put images up there, and people can use images from there. But there's also public images on what's called the Docker Hub. And Microsoft has created a number of public images with SQL Server in it. So for Docker, there's a public image for SQL Server Developer Edition for Linux. And that container will run on Linux, Mac, or Docker for Linux, Docker for Mac, or Docker for Windows. Now understand, there's no license here, right? This is the developer edition that we can use anywhere. So you don't have to worry about a license for that. This is not for production. There's also containers with the Windows version of, or the Windows versions of SQL Server. Now those don't run in Docker for Linux or Docker for Mac. But if you're running Docker for Windows, there's a setting. Is it on the next screen? It'll be on one of my upcoming screens. There's a setting that you can switch in Docker for Windows to say, run this as a host for Windows containers, as opposed to a host for Linux-based containers. So if you're using a Windows container mode in Docker for Windows, then you can also have the image for Developer Edition and SQL Server Express for 2017. There are also licensed images that you can get in Docker Store as opposed to Docker Hub. So the licensed images actually, they start out as the developer, you're getting the same container as the Developer Edition, but then if you're going to be using it in production, then you have to use it, you have to configure it and use your license to do that. So there's more information about that. I'm not using it in that context, so I haven't done that. And for the Windows SKU, you don't have a licensed edition of that yet because the tooling is just not quite mature yet. So we'll get that eventually. Okay, so pulling images. Let me first flip over to the Docker Hub so you can see what I'm talking about with respect to these images. So here's the Docker Hub, and I'm looking at the page that describes the Microsoft MS SQL Server Linux image. So that's the image that's already compiled and ready to go. So the trick is to get this image into your running Docker engine on your machine, and then the Docker engine will manage that. All right, so these are just different versions of as they've evolved it. All right, so that's where it's coming from. This is the public repository. And you don't need to know this whole URL. You just need to know the actual name, because the different mechanisms for pulling, that's what it's called when you pull an image and bring it into your Docker engine. The mechanisms, they know where to look. Like if you have your own repository in your organization, then you'll set that up as the default. But the default is to look on Docker Hub. So that's where Docker engine will look. So these are the different names of the three different images that you can get. And there are a number of ways you can pull them in. They actually can be part of another Docker file. So I, for example, have my own image that is based on the SQL Server for Linux and then adds our old friend AdventureWorks LT to it. So I've got an image that shares SQL Server instance with AdventureWorks already installed on it. There's a whole command line for Docker, and Docker pull is the command that you use to get the certain image into your system. There's also an IDE called Kitematic. I'll show you that shortly. I think I'm going to go over to the terminal and just give you a look at the different Docker, like there's a lot of commands in the Docker CLI. So I'm going to be working with just some of them. Images, to list images. I'm going to be using Docker PS, which shows the running containers already. Docker pull, you're going to see removing a container. This RM removes a container, and RMI removes an image that you've already pulled down and is being managed by Docker Engine. Docker start is one that I use a lot. Docker stop, that's the one that takes the container and just puts it to sleep without getting rid of it totally. Those are the only ones that I really use. Clear. Oh, Kitematic. I'll show you Kitematic. I have that here somewhere. Don't I have that started up? Oh, no. My computer restarted so many times that Kitematic didn't restart. Let me just start that up. Oh, come on. Okay. So this is Kitematic. This is the IDE, and it actually gets in. It's part of the Docker install. What this is doing first, this page here is just showing smattering, it's like the Netflix, right, view of maybe the most popular images that are on the public Docker Hub. And here's some recommended images. And here is from, oh, I'm not logged in, so it doesn't show me my repository in the Docker Hub. But this shows me my images that Docker Engine is managing on my computer already. Okay, so this is a nice way, though, to be able to pull down images and get them into Docker. And remember, the image is just a piece of the puzzle. The image is just sitting there waiting to be started, but you have to actually run it in order for it to be a running container. We'll come back to Kitematic in a bit. So I want to just give you an idea of what it looks like when you pull an image from the command line. I'm not going to actually do it because it might take a little while, especially on my slow internet. So this is just a bunch of screenshots that show, I don't know what that was, that show just the progression. So a Docker image might actually be made up of a bunch of different files because it's got some dependencies on other images and also different moving parts. Some things are more long-term and some things are short-term. So they might be packaged up differently. So I could actually, if I was updating an image, it might only need to update one or two of these actual files. So that's it going through the motions of pulling down the different pieces of the image, and then it tells me the status that it's on the system. Now remember, I pointed out Docker images as one of the CLI commands that shows you a list of all the images on your machine. This is not actually what's on my machine. This is still another screenshot, but this is just showing that after having pulled that image down, now it's being tracked by the Docker engine in the local repository on my computer. Let's take a look at a little bit of that on my computer live. So I'm going to type first Docker PS. Bree, just chime in if you think my font needs to be, oh, it always needs to be bigger, doesn't it? Okay, let me just.
So I can actually see it well on my screen because it's not like I'm in the back of a session room.
Okay, well, it's super big. And of course, now it's the lines are wrapped. So this is telling me, I've just run Docker PS that says, oh, I want to do Docker images first. So I'm just going to clear that and do Docker images. So I only happen to have 2 images loaded up on my computer right now. One is that base MS SQL Server Linux image, and it's very new. I just pulled it in 5 days ago. And then also my image, remember I said that I created an image. It's on the Docker Hub, that's its name. So it's based on the SQL Server. Now I'm going to flip back over to the Docker Hub so you can see that. So this is my MS SQL Server for Linux, and it's tied into my GitHub repo. So if I make a change to the Docker file, then it gets rebuilt. The image will get automatically rebuilt. So I'm going to click over to my GitHub repo, and I can show you my Docker file, right? And you can see at the tippy top here, this is saying this is the base image that I want my image to be built on top of. So my image contains that. If you looked at the SQL Server Docker file, which is, nope, that's mine again. Oh, here it is. Its base image is about as low as you can go. This base image is Ubuntu. Back to the terminal. Okay, so it says Docker images. Let me do Docker PS again to show you what containers are running. So I've got a container based on my MS SQL Server Linux image that's running. I started it up about 30 minutes ago, because that's when my computer rebooted. So something weird, I plugged something in and it rebooted, and it took me 2 times doing that, my external monitor, 2 times doing that to realize it was the external monitor doing that. Anyway, so I created that. I pulled that 5 hours ago. But I'm going to run another command, Docker PS, and then I'm going to use the -A, and that's going to show me all the things, even hidden containers. And now I can see that in addition to the running SQL Server Linux container, I also have an instance of my little AdventureWorks container. It's running, but it's stopped. Okay, so I can just go ahead and start it up again with Docker start, and I'm just going to use the first few characters of its GUID, well, not GUID, of its ID, because it's unique enough. And it started it up. And now it's running. Now, the only thing about a container when you first start running it is the container starts running, and then SQL Server has to go through all this stuff. So let's talk now about actually running a container from an image. And again, I'm going to just do that from slides because it's easier to express this way. So you always start with Docker run. And I'm used to using my a different keyboard. I keep pressing the period to move it forward. Okay. In addition to Docker run, you really need to always say the name of the image that you want to run. Now, I've already pulled that image, so Docker engine on my computer already knows about that and is managing it. But if I hadn't done that yet, then this would cause it to go and pull it either, from whatever my default repository is, and my default is Docker Hub. So it would go to Docker Hub and look for it. But there's more. So we're just building this story up. In addition to specifying which image you want to run, you might need to provide options. And for SQL Server, there are options you have to use, but the options actually go before the name, between Docker run and the name. So the first one is you have to use this environment variable to say that you've accepted the agreement. So -E is Docker, the Docker CLI's parameter for saying, okay, I'm about to give you an environment variable. And the variable is accept EULA, and the value of it is Y. So that's the format that you have to put it in. There's another environment variable that is required. You have to provide it with the SA admin password. And so you have to say -E again for environment variable, and the parameter that's defined is SA_password. And then you just have to set a password that has some little algorithm of, uppercase and numbers and whatever. And actually this one that I have works. So I use that. It's easy for me to remember for demos. So you also need to specify the port. Even though the SQL Server container defaults to being able to connect at 1433, that's SQL Server's port. So this is just the default. This will let you connect to SQL Server inside the running container by using localhost and then 1433. Now, if I changed the first value on that to say, for example, 1401, then when I'm making the connection, it would be localhost port 1401, but within the container, SQL Server is still exposed at 1433. Took me a while to understand that. Now, this is optional, a parameter to say detached mode. And I use this a lot because what detached mode does is if I'm using this at the command line, then it just gives me the command line back and I can keep working with it. Otherwise, it's not running in the background. It just takes over the machine. I've gotten myself into that state a few times. Another thing is that you can provide a name. You don't have to. If we go back here, here's the name that I provided explicitly when I started up SQL Server Linux, but when I started up AdventureWorks LT, I didn't provide a name. And what Docker will do is it has just, this whole list of words, and it just puts two together and that becomes the name. And I didn't understand that at first. I was like, where are all these funny names coming from? Because the combinations can be kind of funny. So you can give it your own. So another option that you can put in there if you want is if you've got a database file on your system, you can attach it right as part of your run command. So that's the syntax for doing that. Now, you can run from Kitematic. You can start up a container from Kitematic, but it's not so easy to start a SQL Server container for Kitematic. And the reason is that you need to, there's the settings. I think it's because it's, oh, wait, go here to the settings. Okay. You can't tie all of those parameters, the environment variables and everything, you can't tie them to an image. All you can do is tie them to a container. So every time you want to start running an image, take an image and start running a container from it, you have to put all those environment variables in again. You can't, I don't know how to store them. Maybe there's a way, but I have not discovered it. You can't store this. You can't store them with an image and make them part of the image definition. So just be warned about that. You know, I find it much easier to just do it from the command line. Now, the other thing I really like, though, about Kitematic is it shows me a log of what's going on what's going on in my container. So when I first start up a container, the container Docker does its thing, but then it's triggering a whole bunch of scripts that SQL Server is running. So maybe you can see some of what's going on. So even though the container comes back, when you say run, it just comes back instantly, says, okay, the container's running. It might take another 10 or 12 seconds before all this other stuff is happening, like the system databases are set up and everything. So I'm not going to drill too much into the Windows container, but I just wanted to at least point out that it's essentially the same, the command line to start up a container, except it took me a while to figure out why it wasn't working when I was testing it out the first time in Windows container, which is that you don't put quotes around the environment variables, right? Because when I was doing this in Bash, I had except EULA equals Y inside of quotes and SA password equals password inside of quotes. So that's just a little tip. And I mentioned that I would have this somewhere here. So if you're running Docker for Windows, there's a setting here where you can switch back and forth to say, I want to use this as a Windows container, or if you've done that already, then it says switch to Linux container. So you have to be in the mode of Windows containers in order to use those Windows versions of SQL Server, those two images. So once you've got your image and you've got your instance running, then it's just a matter of using the server just like you would with SQL Server on any other system. So you've got, you know, all the same options. You can go from the command line. You can use any one of a number of IDEs. I don't know if I'm sure there are a number of people showing SQL Operations Studio today, which is definitely a revelation. I'll actually flip over to that in a minute. Also, Visual Studio Code, I use that a lot on my Mac and on Windows. And there's an MS SQL extension. Actually, the SQL Operations Studio grew out of that. I did a course, a Pluralsight course on the MS SQL extension. And, you know, and other IDs. Any IDE that you can use to connect, any method that you can use to connect to SQL Server, you can use even if the server is in a container. And of course, you can connect from your applications. That's kind of important. So I'm going to flip over here. I'm going to clear this again. Now, I can use SQL Ops Studio or anything, but I always like to just make sure it's really there just at the command line, because there's so much less getting in the way if there's a problem. And I'm just going to use the MS, actually it's called the SQL CLI. Okay, that's to get onto my 1401 is the port that I put my expose my AdventureWorks container from. So that's there. Now I'm just going to get a little list here. Okay, that's running. I'm happy. And I'm going to quit out of here, and I'm going to flip over to SQL Operations Studio, where I'm also connected to both of my little databases there. And of course, we can just drill in and see what we need to see within the databases. So this is just me organizing my different servers. This has nothing to do with some special setup. The main one that I created, I'm going to flip back over to terminal, Docker PS. So the MS SQL Server, I put that one right on 1433. So that's just going to be at localhost because that's the default. This is the one that because you can't expose them to your operating system on the same port, right? So I put this one on 1401. So that's just a little difference between this one I'm connected at just localhost, and this one I'm connected at localhost, 1401 to get into the database. Let me show you. I've got a few more minutes. I'm going to go into here. I want to show you about stopping and removing and starting and the impact of that. So I'm going to create a new database inside of the MS SQL one. SQL create database, and they've got all these nice little snippets. And I'll call this 24 hop. Okay, that looks good. So I'm going to go ahead and run that. Great. Okay, so that exists, and I'm going to just refresh this, and there's the 24 hop database. Now, this gets confused when I'm stopping, removing, restarting my Docker container. So I'm going to just, I meant to disconnect. Oh, well, it's easy enough to reconnect. It's easy enough to spin that back up again. So actually, what I'll do first is I'm going to stop. I'll do it here. Docker stop, and I'm going to do not my AdventureWorks, but the raw one that I just put. Actually, before I do that, proof is in the pudding. MS SQL. Okay, no, I wanted to connect to the other one. This is what happens when the clock is drilling down on you. Little mistakes. So I just want to connect to my MS SQL Server Linux. Okay, and databases. So there you can see the database is there. I'm going to quit out of here, and I'm going to Docker stop that one. I'm going to stop it, not remove it. C69D7, that should be enough. Okay, now I'm going to, hey, go away. Try to connect again, failed to connect. Okay, so it's stopped. Now I'm going to Docker start the same one, D7. And let's see if I'll reconnect. It reconnects, and databases. So 24 hop is still there. Let me show you the difference between that and Docker rm remove force, because otherwise you have to stop first and then remove. C69D7. Okay, Docker run. Okay, you can be like the guy on Big Brother here. Not that one. That's the one I want. I'm going to run it again. Okay, it's running. Woohoo! Now, see there, the log is showing. It's still doing the little bit of all the script, right, for starting that up for the very first time. So the container was ready immediately, but it was doing that, those runtime instructions. So that is done. So that's still a lot faster than installing from the installer, right? And now I will go ahead and MS SQL and databases, right? So there's the difference. Beware between stopping and removing. Stopping, just pause it. You still get a lot of resources back, but everything that is persisted in there stays, and then you can start it again and it's there. Remove is a different beast. Remove really makes it go away. But there is this concept of container volumes. Let that be next. Oh, updating an image. Okay, so you just say Docker pull again, and it will only pull in whatever is new. Remember all the different parts of the image. So already exists. It doesn't waste its time. But you can't do that on a running instance, right? So you have to completely remove the instance and update the image and bring it back again. So we just saw that in action. And so the issue about completely losing any of your databases or data that you might have in that Docker container when you completely remove it is not a total nightmare, because you can create a separate volume to be the host of your data. It's not like a drive, right? It's still a very specific kind of a Docker volume. And I used Katacoda to test out that for the first time and understand how that works. So you create a volume in advance, then you run the container, and part of the parameters of the container is go ahead and connect to that volume. So even if you remove the container, as long as the volume's still running, you can spin up a new container and connect it to that volume. You can connect multiple containers to a data volume. And I'm just gonna, I have all this extra stuff in here depending on how much time I have. So I'm not going to go in detail, but this is just, some quick concepts about data volumes. And there's something called mapped volumes, so you can share those across your network, or just data volumes that are stored in a different running container. And this is more about creating and binding to a volume. And the idea here is you have to run the volume first, and then when you run your container, then you let it know to connect to that volume. It's just part of the parameters. You can also build your own image. I opened up the Docker file from my image just so you could get a quick look at it. And this just walks through the different parts of it. It's just essentially what's happening is, I'm starting with the SQL Server for Linux image, and I'm passing in the environment variables, so I don't have to use those in the run command. So that's nice and convenient. Then along with my Docker file, I have some other files, and these are basically just scripts with my instructions. So I need to copy those instructions into, when the image is run, I need to copy those instructions into the running container. And then if you look on line 14, what that's doing is kind of triggering the first, they're just a waterfall of scripts. One calls another, calls another. So 14, just once once it's running, once those files have been copied into the running container, then I start the first script, which triggers all those other scripts. And one of the other elements in the container is my AdventureWorks. Oh, in this case, no, I don't have the AdventureWorks database. So if I had included that MDF file, one of the commands here would be, like line 11 would be to copy that MDF file. So that would be another thing. And then in my script, I would be attaching the MDF file. This one, just like I said, it's a waterfall of scripts that call each other. And the final one in this example creates a new database, creates a table, and inserts some data into it. So we're just about at the end. Hooray. And not hooray for me. I could talk about this all day, but I think the person who's coming up next will be happy. And so just here's some links. And Ree, I'm sure you guys will have access to be able to share my slides with everybody, list of resources.
The slide deck will be shared, and the videos will be made available, and attendees will get a link when those videos are ready.
Excellent. Okay, so just a couple of things to point out. I've actually written about this and done the course that I did on the MS SQL extension for Visual Studio Code, but there's a whole module in there where I go through this whole business of, what's a container and how to start it up and fiddling around with it and getting that ready. So that should have been a course all by itself. Just some different resources. And now I will hand it over to you, Ree, and I've got a little bit of time left for some questions.
So if you will, there is a slide. If you'll go back to the slide deck coming, there's one that conveniently says questions.
Oh, I was on it.
And
I'm on it.
Go forward one slide.
I'm there.
Coming up next just go forward one slide.
It's there. There's a latency thing. I don't know if other people can't see it yet or just you.
Okay, so coming up next is the Essential Linux for the DBA. Kellen Povin Gorman is giving that one. So that will be awesome. Let me go ahead and get to these questions for you, Julie. You had a slide that said Docker doesn't involve Hyper-V, but someone asked, they said it was a little confusing because they thought there was a dependency on Hyper-V. Is that the
I think
case?
in Docker for Windows, because I was messing with that today and I had to reboot my machine. I think for Docker for Windows, but let me say I am not a DevOps person. So I was passing that along from Travis Wright.
Okay. Okay.
So
And
yeah, sorry.
is SSIS or SSISDB available for Docker file and containers?
I don't believe there's an image of with those things in there. Maybe you can connect
Okay.
from, just like I was saying, you could connect from SQL Server Management Studio to the SQL Server instance inside your container. Then you could do that. That would be the way to do that. Remember, I'm not a DBA, I'm not a DBA or an IT pro. So far we're 2 and 2 for like, I don't know.
So someone asks, why do you need to include the port twice? So 1433, 1433.
That one really confuses me. That's their so 1433 is the default, and you have to you need to the two numbers. First of all, they're not a range. It took me a while to understand this. I thought they were a range. The first number is supposed to represent the port to which you connect. So I showed you that I was on 1401 Docker. Oh, quit. Sorry, Docker PS. So this is exposed through 1401, and maybe you saw when I was doing this, when I was connecting with MS SQL, I said, -O, or if you look at here, right, that's exposed from the container to the consumer so that you can connect to it. And then the port within the container is 1433. So that default one, where I just said instead of 1401 where I was explicit, where it was 1433, I just think that's what it needs, because you can't say 0, right? It's just
Oh,
like
so
use the default, because that's just plain old, that just puts it at plain old localhost. So that might
okay.
just be
So
a weird
it
syntax.
needs a range. It needs a range, but when there's only one, you're saying it starts and ends here. It's like character one and only give me one.
Something like that. So
Okay.
and I thought, since it's the default, what happens if I don't specify it in the Docker run command and it doesn't work? So
Oh,
that's just the default. And then if you want to expose it on another port, and I'm trying to be clear about exposing it to the consumer as opposed to within the container. SQL Server's on 1433. So I exposed my container at 1401, right? So those are different things. So if you want to have a specific one, and you have to have different, you can't expose them on the same range.
okay.
It took me a
And
while
let's
to
see.
understand that.
Okay. Can we connect to SQL Server running in Docker from a client machine, which is different than the host machine?
Yes, I haven't done it across a network, but you should absolutely be able to do that.
So someone has provided the answer, by the way, and he says
Yeah, because it hosts on Windows Server, it hosts on Azure. Those are different machines.
okay. So an attendee has said that the 1433 and the 1433 are actually host colon container.
So the host is 1401,
Or
host
when it's
colon.
1433 and 1433, that one is host and that both the host and the container are the same.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah,
Okay.
like enough with the DBA and the IT Pro questions. Come on, I'm a developer.
Yeah.
No, kidding.
Um,
Thanks for the help.
and let's see. So I am getting like a few just comments, which isn't helping. Is there a max size for Docker volumes?
I don't know.
Okay. I don't either.
Jeez, I'm so sorry. I can't answer any of these questions. But now I want to know. I'll know myself. So what are we going to do with these questions? Can I get them and we can write the correct answers to them and share them somehow with all this content?
I have no idea.
Okay. That's why I have a blog.
They kind of go away when the session ends, but I've captured them. So
Okay.
hopefully,
Okay. But I can blog them.
Okay. So let's see if I have any more that I think you could answer in the time that we have. There's a lot of compliments in the questions, by the
Oh,
way.
thank you. Thank you.
And this one may have fallen under a previous question. No, that doesn't matter. Sometimes they don't make sense. Sometimes they ask me questions in like several lines and they don't make sense.
Yeah. See if I can.
What about enabling features other than the database engine, like advanced analytics or integration services? Are there any images that include these out of the box?
Oh, no, I no, because they're just the 3 images so far. Oh, I don't see the questions here anyway. They're just
Okay.
those 3 images, which are just the base servers. So they don't have SQL Server Management Studio in them, right? You would use that yourself. So all the analytics that comes with
Okay.
those packages.
Okay, so that's all that we have for today. Thank you very, very much for presenting today. It was wonderful.
Thanks for asking me to talk about a really, really fun topic.
All of you that are out there, thank you very, very much for attending. Remember, an evaluation will pop up when the session is over, and that SQL Server for Linux is up next. So hopefully you've registered for that one as